The sun had been blazing over the desert for hours, painting the land in harsh shades of gold and ochre. Heat shimmered off the sand, making the horizon waver like a mirage, and the wind whispered through the sparse cacti with a dry, rattling sigh. Somewhere out there, far from any town or trail, a lone figure stumbled, her dress torn and dusted with sand. Her skin burned by the merciless sun, she moved with staggering determination, though every step seemed heavier than the last, her strength fading as if the desert itself were swallowing her whole. She was a mail-order bride, traveling to a new life that promised hope and perhaps love. Yet right now hope felt like a distant memory, and survival was slipping through her fingers like grains of sand. Her lips were cracked, her throat parched, and her heart pounded with exhaustion and fear. She had been walking for hours, maybe days, after a wagon mishap left her stranded in the wilderness. Each tumble over rocks and sand left fresh cuts on her arms, yet she pressed on, driven by a fragile will to live. The wind carried no water, no shade, no promise of salvation, only the oppressive weight of the desert. Somewhere deep down, she feared she wouldn't make it, that she might become nothing more than another lost soul swallowed by the unyielding landscape. But then, faintly at first, she heard a soft rustling in the distance, like the wind, yet steadier alive. Her heart leaped, but caution held her back. Could it be rescuers, or some other danger? The stories of the West were full of both, and she had learned too well that strangers could bring either salvation or peril. She squinted through the glare of the sun, and saw 3 figures moving with a grace and certainty that seemed impossible in this rough terrain. They were Apaches, tall and strong, moving silently, yet decisively, their eyes scanning the horizon as if they had been expecting someone or something. She wanted to call out, but her voice was a raspy whisper barely audible over the desert wind. The 3 men noticed her almost immediately, their expressions unreadable, their movements careful yet deliberate. One of them stepped forward, his eyes locking onto hers with a sharp intensity that both frightened and reassured her. Without a word, they approached, the ground crunching beneath their boots in rhythm with the beating of her heart. She had heard tales of the Apache warriors, hunters, fierce protectors of their land, but these men didn't seem threatening. There was something almost reverent in the way they watched her struggle, as if they recognized her pain and refused to let the desert claim her. Her knees buckled beneath her, and she collapsed onto the sand. One of the men knelt beside her, his hands gentle yet firm as he lifted her. She tried to speak, to thank them, but her throat was dry, and her words failed. Instead he pressed a canteen to her lips, and she drank greedily, the cool water searing through her parched body like a lifeline. The other 2 men worked quickly, fashioning a makeshift support so they could carry her without harming her further. They moved with a synchronicity that suggested years of experience, and though she could not understand their language, she felt a silent promise in their actions. They would not let her die here. The desert sun continued its relentless march across the sky, but now she was not alone. The 3 Apaches seemed to blend with the land, moving as one with the dunes and rocks, guiding her through hidden paths that she could never have discovered on her own. Every so often, one would glance at her, checking her pulse, her breathing, her condition, and she felt a strange mixture of gratitude and fear. Who were these men, and why did they care so much for a stranger in a land that demanded toughness and self-reliance? The questions burned in her mind, but the answers could wait right now. Survival was all that mattered. As they pressed on, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the desert floor. The temperature began to drop, bringing a sharp chill that nipped at her scorched skin. And the men wrapped her in a rough blanket they carried, shielding her from the sudden cold. Their movements remained quiet and efficient, never slowing, never faltering. It was as if the desert itself had become a test, and these 3 warriors were determined that she would pass it. At one point they reached a narrow canyon, where the wind whistled through jagged rocks. She clung to the makeshift support, too weak to stand alone, her mind spinning with exhaustion and curiosity. The tallest of the 3 men stopped and signaled the others. They huddled together briefly, speaking in low, urgent tones she could not understand, and then continued, their pace unwavering. She realized, with a mixture of awe and apprehension, that they were not just saving her, they were protecting her from something more. Something the desert held in its shadowy corners. Night began to settle, painting the sky in bruised purples and deep blues. and the desert took on a strange, haunting beauty. Stars appeared like distant fires, and the moon rose pale and watchful. She had never felt so vulnerable, yet so strangely safe. The Apache's presence was a shield, a promise that she might yet live to see the sunrise beyond this cruel land. But even in their company, the desert whispered threats, and she could sense that danger was not far behind. Perhaps it was the wind, or perhaps it was something else, something waiting, watching, testing the limits of her endurance and the resolve of her rescuers. Her thoughts drifted to the life she had left behind the letters, the hope of a husband she had never met, the family that waited across the miles. All of it seemed fragile now, like a dream hanging by a thread in a storm. She wondered if she would ever reach that life, or if the desert would claim her before she could. And yet the three Apaches carried her onward, each step a defiance of fate, a statement that she was not yet done, not yet lost. As the night deepened, a howl echoed through the canyon, sharp and unnerving, and she shivered despite the blanket. One of the men's hands rested lightly on his bow, eyes scanning the darkness, alert and watchful. She realized then that survival in this desert was not just about endurance, it was about vigilance, about trust, and about courage she had not known she possessed. These men had sworn to keep her alive, and though she could not yet grasp why, she felt the weight of that vow settle over her like a mantle. Somewhere ahead, the canyon narrowed, and the darkness grew denser, shadows folding in on themselves. The three Apaches exchanged another silent signal, and she felt the tension in the air shift, as though they were about to confront whatever force lurked in the night. Her heart pounded in her chest, fear mingling with hope. And she realized that the desert had become more than a landscape. It was a test of every fiber of her being, a trial she could not face alone. Yet she was not alone. Not with them. And then, as they rounded a jagged rock face, she saw it. A flicker of light in the distance, faint but unmistakable, promising shelter, warmth, perhaps even safety. Relief surged through her, mingled with uncertainty. Who had made that fire? Could she truly trust it, or was it a trap laid by the desert to lure the unwary? She swallowed hard, leaning on the men for support, and felt the weight of the journey pressing down. She was a mail-order bride, alone and desperate in the desert, yet not entirely without hope. The next step could be salvation, or it could bring a danger she was not prepared for. Her eyes met the gaze of the tallest Apache, and for a brief moment, something passed between them, an unspoken promise that they would not abandon her, that they would see her through the night. But even as that reassurance settled over her, the desert remained vast, wild, and merciless. She had survived the sun, the sand, the scorching heat, and the endless walk. But the night held its own threats, and the journey was far from over. The fire in the distance flickered again, and the wind carried with it the faint scent of smoke and earth. She tried to steady her breathing, to gather what little strength remained, knowing that whatever lay ahead would test them all. The three Apaches moved closer, forming a protective circle around her, and she realized that the story of her survival was only beginning. The desert had not yet claimed her, but it had shown her just how fragile life could be, and how courage often came from the most unexpected places. And in that moment, as the shadows deepened and the night whispered its secrets, she understood that the desert could take everything, or it could be a place where unexpected alliances were forged, where trust and determination might just tip the scales in favor of life. She took a shaky breath, leaning on those who had sworn to protect her, and stepped forward toward the flickering light, unaware of what awaited, but certain of one truth: she would not give up. Not yet. The canyon grew darker with each step, and the fire ahead seemed both a beacon and a warning. The desert held its breath, and so did she. The story of the mail-order bride, lost and dying in the merciless land, was far from over. What came next could change everything, but for now, survival rested in the hands of three Apaches and a fragile woman who refused to surrender. The fire flickered in the distance, casting long shadows that danced across the canyon walls, and she felt a strange mixture of fear and relief. The three Apaches guided her carefully, each step deliberate and cautious, as though the desert itself held eyes in the dark. She leaned heavily on the tallest of the three, whose silent presence was both grounding and unsettling. She did not know their names, or why they had appeared when the desert seemed ready to claim her, but she felt the weight of their promise pressing against her like a shield. As they approached the source of the fire, the scent of burning wood and dry sage filled her senses. It was a faint comfort, hinting at life and shelter, yet it carried an edge of danger she could not ignore. Fires in the desert were rare, especially at night, and she wondered who could be there. Perhaps travelers like herself, or perhaps someone far less friendly. The thought made her stomach churn, but the Apaches seemed unafraid, moving with confidence that belied the shadows lurking around them. She realized then that they knew this land in ways she could never hope to understand. The tallest man paused for a moment, his head tilting as he listened to the wind. Then he signaled to the other two, and they altered their path, veering slightly to avoid what appeared to be a narrow opening between jagged rocks. She could not see it, but she trusted their instincts. She had no choice. Each step forward was a surrender to the unknown, and yet every instinct told her that survival demanded it. As they moved, she tried to piece together how she had ended up in this situation. The journey had begun with hope and excitement, a new life, a chance to escape the small town she had always called home. Her letters had been full of dreams, of what her future husband might be like, of the family and life she would build. She had imagined meeting him at a station, smiling through nervous introductions, and stepping into a carriage that would carry her to a life filled with possibility. Instead, she found herself alone in the desert, her hopes reduced to dust in the wind. The memory made her chest ache, but she could not dwell on it now. The desert would not wait for sorrow. Her thoughts were interrupted when one of the Apaches glanced back at her, his eyes sharp and assessing. She noticed the faintest hint of concern in his gaze, and it struck her that despite their calm confidence, there was an awareness of danger. Perhaps they were not only guiding her, but protecting her from something far more threatening than thirst or heat. She shivered, the night air biting at her sun-scorched skin, and realized that the desert was alive in ways she had never imagined. The three men moved silently, their steps almost soundless against the rocky terrain. She wondered about their story, what had brought them to this place, what bonds held them together, and why they had chosen to save a stranger. She imagined the years of training, the hunts and battles, the lives they must have led to survive in such harsh surroundings. Each of them carried an air of quiet authority, a presence shaped by experience and necessity. She felt both gratitude and curiosity, but words would not come easily. Exhaustion weighed down her tongue. As they neared the fire, she began to notice details that suggested the place had not been abandoned. Footprints in the sand were fresh, and the smoke rose from carefully arranged wood, not from a haphazard blaze. Someone was here, and they were aware of their surroundings. The thought made her uneasy. Who could it be? Travelers seeking refuge, or someone with intent far less welcoming? She glanced at the Apaches, and their postures shifted subtly, alert yet calm. She realized that whatever lay ahead, it was not the first time they had faced the unknown. The canyon narrowed further, and the fire came into view fully. It illuminated a small clearing, and she could see shapes moving near the flames, figures hunched over the fire, hands busy with tasks she could not yet discern. The figures froze momentarily as the Apaches approached, then resumed their work as if assessing the newcomers. She could not tell if they were hostile or simply wary of strangers, but she felt a pulse of tension in the air, thick and tangible. The desert had grown quiet around them, as though holding its breath. One of the Apaches raised a hand, and she froze instinctively. He gestured for her to stay close, and lowered himself to the ground, eyes scanning the shadows. The other two followed suit, creating a protective circle around her. She could feel their focus, the unspoken communication between them, and she understood that trust here was earned in silence and caution. Her pulse quickened, both from fear and from a strange awe. These men were not merely guides, they were guardians, and the desert was their domain. As they drew nearer, one of the figures by the fire spoke. The language was foreign, a series of sharp and fluid sounds that she could not comprehend. Yet the tone carried a wary curiosity. One of the Apaches responded, equally guarded, and the exchange seemed tense but not violent. She realized then that there was more at play than simple survival. This was a meeting of worlds, a delicate balance of understanding and caution. Her presence added another layer. of complexity, and she felt the weight of it pressing against her, reminding her of her vulnerability in this harsh, unfamiliar land. She noticed that the people by the fire were not fully alone. Small bundles of belongings lay neatly arranged nearby, suggesting that these travelers or perhaps settlers had made camp for more than a night. The thought sparked a flicker of hope, tempered by the uncertainty of who they were and what their intentions might be. The desert, after all, had a way of hiding both danger and salvation in the same shadows. She leaned slightly against the Apache nearest her, feeling the steadiness of his presence, and realized how much she had come to rely on them in the span of a few hours. The tallest Apache spoke briefly, his words concise and commanding, and the figures by the fire responded with cautious nods. She could not understand the conversation, but the tone suggested a fragile truce. The desert had drawn them together, and yet every step forward was laced with tension, a reminder that trust was fragile and that danger could be just a breath away. She felt the weight of that truth pressing against her chest, mixing fear and gratitude in equal measure. As the night deepened, she tried to piece together what the Apaches had told her through gestures and tone. They had been tracking her progress, she realized, watching from afar until her survival was in immediate danger. They had chosen this moment to intervene, not out of obligation, but out of principle, loyalty, or perhaps something she could not yet comprehend. She marveled at their skill, at their ability to navigate the desert with such precision, and at the quiet strength that seemed to radiate from them. It was a strength born of hardship, of life lived in a world that demanded constant vigilance. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the night sky, and she felt the desert's silence around her deepen. The figures by the fire moved again, preparing a modest meal, and she realized that the human presence offered a small, fragile hope of comfort in this unforgiving land. Yet the tension lingered, a reminder that safety in the desert was never guaranteed, and that every moment carried the possibility of danger. She shivered, drawing the blanket closer around her, and felt the Apache's eyes on her, watchful and protective. Her mind wandered briefly to the journey she had left behind, to the letters she had written, the dreams she had nurtured, and the stranger waiting at the end of this path she could scarcely imagine surviving. The desert had stripped her of illusion, yet it had revealed something more vital: resilience, courage, and the unlikeliest forms of protection. She felt an unfamiliar respect for the land, harsh as it was, and for the people who moved through it with purpose and awareness. Survival here was not merely a matter of endurance, it was about understanding, observation, and an almost instinctual connection to every shifting shadow and whispering wind. The night stretched on, deepening the shadows, and the desert seemed to grow alive around them. She noticed the Apaches' constant vigilance, the way their eyes darted to the dark corners of the canyon, their hands never far from their weapons. Understood that the danger was not merely imagined. Something lingered, unseen but sensed, and it could reveal itself at any moment. Her pulse quickened, and she felt the raw edge of fear sharpen in her chest. Yet with the Apaches by her side, that fear was tempered by an unspoken assurance that they would not abandon her, that the desert had not yet claimed her. Hours passed in tense quiet, the fire providing warmth and light, the desert breathing around them like a living entity. She felt her strength returning slowly, bolstered by water and the gentle care of the Apaches. She wondered about their lives, the paths they had walked, and the stories the desert held for them. Each glance, each gesture, hinted at experiences she could not fathom. Lives shaped by hardship, loyalty, and survival in a land that gave nothing freely. The mystery of who they were and why they had chosen to protect her lingered in her mind, adding to the weight of suspense that had settled over the night. The canyon walls seemed to close in, shadows folding over one another, and she realized that dawn was still far away. The desert would remain unforgiving, and the night's dangers were far from over. Yet in that fragile circle of firelight, she found a momentary refuge, a place where survival was possible, and where trust, though tentative, had begun to form. She understood that the path ahead would test her in ways she could not yet imagine, that the desert held secrets and threats still unseen, and so she rested briefly, leaning on the Apaches, listening to the desert around her and feeling the tension of the night settle like a heavy cloak. The fire flickered, the wind whispered through the rocks, and the unknown stretched ahead, vast and merciless, The journey of the mail-order bride was far from over. The desert had revealed only the first of its challenges, and she knew that the next steps would demand every ounce of courage, trust, and determination she could summon. The night stretched on endlessly, the fire sputtering and casting trembling shadows across the canyon walls. She could hear the desert settling into its nocturnal rhythm, the soft rustle of wind through the rocks, the distant call of a coyote, the faint scuff of sand moving under unseen paws. Each sound set her heart racing, but the Apaches around her seemed unshaken. They moved with a quiet certainty, scanning every shadow, listening to every whisper the desert offered. She realized that survival here demanded more than stamina. It required awareness, patience, and the instinct to read danger before it struck. She tried to ask questions to learn more about the three men who had saved her life, but her voice still came in raspy whispers. The tallest one tilted his head slightly, motioning for her to stay quiet. Yet, instead of words, he used gestures, brief and precise, pointing toward the fire and then the canyon walls, conveying warnings she could barely grasp. She understood enough to know that something or someone was moving in the dark. The thought tightened the grip of fear around her chest, but there was also a strange reassurance in their vigilance. These men were not just strangers, they were protectors, trained to navigate this harsh and unforgiving land. The fire crackled, and in the dim glow, she could see the figures by the fire more clearly. They were a small group, huddled close to the flames, their faces shadowed and unreadable. She sensed wariness in their movements, as if they had been watching for danger for hours. One of the Apaches stepped forward, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. He spoke in a low, measured tone, and the figures by the fire responded cautiously. The language was foreign to her, but the tension in the air spoke louder than words. She could feel it pressing on her, a weight of expectation and unspoken rules, and she realized that the desert had drawn them all into a precarious balance. She noticed small details in the camp bundles of supplies neatly stacked, crude shelter built against the canyon wall, and footprints that crisscrossed the sand in careful, deliberate patterns. The people here were survivors, she realized, and like the Apaches, they knew the desert demanded respect and constant vigilance. Yet there was something else, a subtle unease in the way they moved, a silent question hanging between them and her protectors. Was it suspicion? Or had they sensed the same threat lurking in the night that kept the Apaches alert? She could not tell, and the uncertainty made her stomach twist. While the Apaches maintained their protective circle, she allowed her eyes to wander over the canyon. The darkness seemed almost alive, folding in on itself, hiding shapes and movements that made her pulse quicken. Every shift of wind, every whisper of sand against rock felt like a signal, a warning. She could not shake the feeling that they were being watched, not just by the camp, but by the desert itself. It was a presence that could not be named, a tension that wrapped around them like a coil, waiting for the right moment to strike. She shivered despite the blanket, the unease settling deeper into her bones. Her mind drifted back to the journey she had undertaken. She had come west with dreams of a new life, letters filled with hope and promises that felt distant now. The desert had stripped her of illusions, leaving only raw survival and a fragile trust in three men whose lives were entwined with the land in ways she could not begin to understand. Yet in the firelight she glimpsed something more, a possibility that her story could continue, that the trials of the desert could lead not just to suffering, but to growth and unexpected alliances. The thought brought a small measure of comfort, even as the tension around them thickened. The tallest Apache lowered himself to the ground, eyes scanning the shadows beyond the fire. His companions mirrored him, each maintaining a careful watch while keeping her close. She realized they were forming more than a protective circle. They were creating a barrier between her and the unknown, a thin line of safety against threats she could not see. The weight of that protection was both comforting and unnerving. She owed her life to these men, yet she did not know their motives or the boundaries of their loyalty. She could only trust, and trust here felt like a gamble with life itself. As she watched, one of the figures in the camp moved away from the fire, crouching low as if to examine the sand. The movement was subtle but deliberate, and it caught the attention of the Apaches instantly. The tallest man signaled to the others, and they shifted silently, a ripple of readiness passing between them. The desert seemed to hold its breath, the wind pausing in its course, and she felt the tension spike in her chest. Whatever this was, it was not ordinary. The men's reaction told her that danger could emerge from even the smallest action. Her thoughts flickered to the stories she had heard of the West tales of ambushes, bandits, an untamed land where life was fragile and fleeting. She had imagined danger in simple forms: a rattlesnake, a sudden storm, or a harsh stretch of sand. But the desert had revealed a more complex reality, where threats could be hidden in shadow. In movement, in the very air around her, she was learning slowly that survival here depended not just on strength, but on reading signs, understanding intent, and trusting instincts shaped by experience. One of the Apaches shifted slightly, bringing a small, leather-wrapped bundle from the fire. He handed it to the tallest man, who examined it briefly before nodding and tucking it into his cloak. She could not see what was inside, but the gesture carried significance and acknowledgement of risk, a preparation for what might come. The other two men adjusted their positions, their eyes never leaving the darkness beyond the camp. She realized that the night had become a chessboard, each move calculated, each silence loaded with meaning. The figures by the fire resumed their activity, but the tension did not lessen. One of them approached cautiously, holding something that glinted faintly in the firelight. The Apaches tensed, their hands brushing near their weapons, and she felt the sharp edge of fear cut through her. She could sense that this was a delicate moment, a test of intentions and trust. Every heartbeat was amplified, every shadow a potential threat. She leaned back slightly, seeking reassurance from the men who had brought her this far, and felt their silent strength pressing against her. Hours passed in this fragile equilibrium, the desert holding them in a suspended state between safety and danger. She learned to move with caution, to whisper when necessary, to watch the subtle shifts in the sand and firelight. She began to notice patterns in the Apaches' vigilance, the way their eyes flicked from shadow to shadow, the small signals they exchanged with gestures, the quiet assessment of every figure in the camp. She realized that these men were not just protectors, they were masters of the land, attuned to threats she could not perceive, and committed to ensuring her survival at all costs. The fire began to die down, and with it the glow that had offered a fragile sense of security. Darkness deepened, and the canyon seemed to press in from all sides. She shivered, feeling the chill of night and the weight of uncertainty pressing on her mind. Somewhere beyond the fire, she sensed movement again, quick, deliberate, purposeful. The Apaches reacted instantly, forming a tighter circle and signaling with subtle gestures. Her pulse raced as she realized that the desert's quiet had been deceptive. Threats could emerge at any moment, and they were ready. She tried to steady her breathing, to focus on the warmth of the fire and the presence of her protectors. But her mind refused to calm. Questions tumbled over one another. Who were these people by the fire, really? Were they allies or potential foes? And what dangers still lurked beyond the canyon walls, hidden in shadows and sand? Every answer seemed to lead to another question, every sense of safety balanced on a knife's edge. The tallest Apache shifted his position slightly, eyes narrowing as he scanned the darkness. One of the camp figures froze, then slowly lowered whatever they had been holding. The tension eased marginally, but only just. She realized that this night, this moment, was a turning point, yet the outcome remained uncertain. Every detail mattered, the smallest movement, the faintest sound, the decisions made by those around her. The desert had taught her that life and death could hinge on the subtlest of cues, and she understood that survival depended on alertness, trust, and a willingness to face the unknown. Her thoughts drifted again to the journey she had taken to reach this point. The letters she had written, the hopes she had carried, the dream of a new life, all of it felt distant now, overshadowed by the immediate reality of survival. Yet she also felt a strange resilience growing within her, a sense that she could endure, adapt, and perhaps even thrive if she learned the rules of this land. The Apaches had become more than protectors. They were teachers, guides, and witnesses to a struggle that went beyond mere survival. The night pressed on, and the canyon seemed to close around them. Shadows stretched and shifted, carrying secrets she could not read. The fire flickered one last time, casting a brief glow on the wary faces around her, before settling into smoldering embers. She drew the blanket tighter around herself, listening to the faint rustle of sand, the whisper of wind, and the quiet breaths of those who would become her guardians. The desert held its mysteries close, and the night was far from over. She realized that the journey ahead would demand more than strength. It would require trust, courage, and the willingness to confront dangers she could not yet see. The Apaches had brought her this far, but the desert's challenges were far from resolved. And the people by the fire carried their own secrets and motives. Every moment was a test, every choice a potential turning point. And somewhere in the dark, the unknown waited, patient and unyielding, ready to challenge her, them, and the fragile truce that held the night together. The night deepened, and the desert seemed to tighten around them, each shadow folding in on itself, each gust of wind carrying a hint of danger. The fire that had offered fragile warmth now glowed low, casting flickering shapes across the canyon walls, making the figures around it look larger and more threatening than they were. She stayed close to the tallest Apache, feeling the steadiness of his presence beneath her trembling hands, aware that the quiet vigilance that had protected her so far was about to be tested. The figures by the fire shifted again, moving in patterns that made her pulse quicken. She could sense the tension vibrating through the canyon, a silent warning that something unseen was drawing nearer. The Apache's eyes darted constantly, reading the shadows, listening to the faintest changes in the air. Each small movement in the camp, each subtle sound from the desert beyond felt magnified, as if the canyon itself were alive, holding its breath in anticipation. She clutched the blanket tighter around her, feeling the rough fabric scrape against her skin, and wished she could hide within it like a shield from the unknown. Suddenly, a distant sound cut through the stillness, a rustling that was too deliberate to be the wind, too quiet to be an animal. The Apaches stiffened instantly, exchanging a brief glance, their muscles coiled like springs ready to strike. Her heart thudded painfully, each beat echoing in her ears. She could feel the fear pressing down on her, yet it was mixed with a strange exhilaration. Survival had always been a fragile thing, and now she was confronted with a moment where every instinct mattered. One of the Apaches gestured sharply, motioning for her to crouch lower. The other two moved to cover the canyon exits, forming a silent barrier between her and whatever approached. She sank closer to the ground, feeling the sand cool beneath her, trying to steady her breath, knowing that any sound might draw attention. The desert's darkness was complete now, swallowing the edges of the firelight, and she realized how small and vulnerable she truly was. Yet she also felt the invisible shield of these men around her, their presence a promise that she was not alone. The rustling grew closer, accompanied by a faint metallic clink. Her stomach tightened. The Apache's eyes never left the movement beyond the canyon wall, hands hovering near weapons as they silently signaled to one another. Every second felt stretched, every shadow a potential threat. She had never understood danger like this before, not a threat you could see clearly, but one that existed in the tension, in the quiet moments before action, in the anticipation that made her muscles ache with readiness. Suddenly, a figure stepped out from the darkness, and the firelight revealed a stranger, cloaked and moving cautiously. The Apaches reacted instantly, weapons raised but not yet striking, eyes sharp and assessing. The stranger froze, raising empty hands in a gesture of truce, yet the tension in their stance spoke volumes. She could feel her own pulse racing as the canyon seemed to shrink around them, every shadow sharpening, every sound amplified. The desert had become a trap, and the stakes were higher than she had ever imagined. The tallest Apache spoke softly, words she could not understand, but the tone carried authority and warning. The stranger responded with equal caution, shifting slightly, eyes flicking to her as if assessing whether she posed a threat. She realized with a jolt that her presence made her a pivot point in this standoff, and fear clenched at her chest. Every instinct screamed that one wrong move could shatter the fragile balance, that the night could erupt into chaos in a single heartbeat. A sudden gust of wind blew through the canyon, rattling loose rocks and sending sparks from the dying fire into the air. She flinched, imagining the sparks igniting something else, anything else. And the Apaches moved with seamless precision, shielding her and keeping the stranger in their sight. Her heart hammered as she realized the desert was playing its part, testing them all, forcing each decision into sharper focus. The air seemed to hum with tension, and the canyon itself felt like it might collapse under the weight of expectation. Minutes stretched, each one an eternity. The stranger made a cautious step forward, then froze, as if waiting for a signal. One of the Apaches made a subtle gesture. She realized that this was a game of signals and reading intent, a dance that required patience and precision. Her throat was dry, and her body ached from exhaustion, but she knew she could not afford to move carelessly. Every breath mattered, every heartbeat echoed in the silent canyon, and the desert seemed to tighten its grip around them, daring them to falter. The stranger finally spoke, low and measured, but she could not catch the words. The Apaches responded, and the canyon held its collective breath. She sensed that there was a history here, unspoken yet palpable, a tension that went beyond simple survival. Perhaps these people had encountered one another before, or perhaps the desert had created a meeting of fates that none could control. Whatever the reason, the moment felt like the tipping point of something far larger, a clash of intent that could explode into violence at any second. She caught glimpses of movement beyond the fire, shadows shifting in ways that made her stomach tighten. Perhaps it was the wind, perhaps it was something else. The Apaches did not react, yet she could see the sharp calculation in their eyes, the constant, subtle adjustments in posture, the readiness to strike or defend in an instant. She realized that she had been sheltered until now by their vigilance, but the night was about to demand more than she had faced before. One of the figures by the fire reached for a weapon tucked at their side. The Apache's response was instantaneous, a flash of motion and alertness that drew her gaze. The canyon seemed to hold its breath, and for a moment, the desert's vast emptiness felt suffocating, as if the wind, the rocks, and the darkness were conspiring to hold them all in suspense. She could feel every muscle tensing, every nerve screaming in anticipation, aware that the coming moments might decide the fates of everyone here. Her thoughts flickered to her own vulnerability. She was a stranger in this land, a mail-order bride far from home, reliant entirely on the skill and judgment of three men she barely knew. Yet in that reliance, she found a strange sense of courage, a willingness to witness what might unfold, even as fear gripped her. The desert had stripped her of illusion and left her raw, exposed and aware of every heartbeat, every shadow, every whisper of danger. Suddenly, a low hiss came from the darkness beyond the fire, subtle but sharp. The Apaches stiffened, weapons ready, eyes narrowing as the canyon seemed to shift and close around them. She felt her pulse spike, realizing that this was no ordinary threat. The desert had brought them here to the edge of something far more dangerous, and the balance between safety and peril was thinner than ever. Her chest tightened as the tension coiled around her like a living thing, and she understood that the next moments could determine who would survive and who would fall. The stranger's movements grew more deliberate, cautious, yet determined, as if they had a purpose that could not be denied. The Apaches shifted to counter subtle gestures that spoke of strategy, experience, and an unspoken bond between them. She realized that the night had become a battlefield of intent, silent war in which every glance, every step, and every breath carried weight. The firelight flickered across the canyon walls, illuminating tension etched into every face, every gesture, every silent calculation. She tried to steady herself, to prepare for what might come, but the desert offered no answers. The air was thick with anticipation, the canyon alive with movement, and the shadows seemed to stretch and twist, hiding more than they revealed. She leaned closer to the tallest Apache, feeling his steady presence, and knew that she had come too far to falter now. Every instinct told her to be still, to watch, to survive, and to trust in those who had saved her life. A sudden, sharp sound echoed metal against rock, and the Apaches moved in unison. Weapons poised, bodies coiled like springs. She felt a shock of fear, but also a strange clarity. This was the moment the desert had been leading to, the point where survival, skill, and courage would be tested. She could not know what lay ahead, only that danger was imminent, and the next actions would define everything. The canyon seemed to pulse with possibility and threat, a crucible that would demand the utmost of all involved. Her breath came in shallow gasps, the fire casting fleeting shadows that made the night seem alive, conspiratorial, and unpredictable. The stranger froze again, the desert holding a collective silence, and she realized that the climax of this long, perilous night was just beyond reach. The Apache's vigilance did not waver, their presence a thin line between her and the unknown. and the desert waited patiently for the moment to reveal its hand. Every instinct screamed that what was coming would change everything, that the fragile balance could shatter in an instant, and that survival rested on courage, wit, and trust. She closed her eyes briefly, feeling the weight of exhaustion and fear pressing against her, yet also a spark of determination. The desert had tested her, had stripped away comfort and certainty, and now demanded more than she had ever known. She was not alone, yet she was acutely aware of how fragile the protection around her was, how easily the balance could tip. The night stretched on, the canyon shadows deepened, and the fire flickered low, marking the edge of something immense and unavoidable. And then, just as the wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of smoke and earth, she felt it, the first pulse of inevitability. The moment of confrontation was coming, the tension she had felt for hours coiling tighter, ready to snap. The desert was no longer simply a backdrop. It was an active participant, shaping every move, every choice, every heartbeat. The Apaches tightened their circle, the stranger froze in place, and she realized that the night would not allow pause. The climax was near, and nothing would ever be the same again. The tension in the canyon broke suddenly, like a rope snapping after being pulled taut for too long. A gust of wind swept through, scattering sparks from the fire into the night sky, and for a moment, everything felt suspended between fear and relief. The stranger lowered the weapon slowly, revealing a face marked by exhaustion and uncertainty. The Apaches' hands remained near their own weapons, but their posture softened, the rigid lines of defense easing into cautious trust. She felt her own chest loosen, a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding escaping in a shaky sigh. The tallest Apache stepped forward cautiously, signaling with gestures that this stranger was no longer an immediate threat. The man responded, speaking softly, words she could not understand, but the tone carried apology, explanation, and a hint of gratitude. The other two Apaches relaxed as well, their eyes still alert but no longer sharpened by fear. She realized that the balance of the night had shifted, that the danger had passed without violence, and yet the desert's lesson lingered. Trust and vigilance were fragile, and survival was earned in silence and observation as much as in action. She lowered herself fully to the ground, feeling the sand beneath her knees, exhausted but relieved. The Apaches gestured for her to stay close to the fire, and one of them broke off to fetch water from a small canteen tucked nearby. She drank slowly, savoring the cool liquid, letting it chase away the dryness that had haunted her throat for hours. Each sip reminded her of how close she had come to the edge, how easily the desert could have claimed her, dead, and yet how the presence of these three men had tipped the odds in her favor. The stranger, by the fire, shifted again, kneeling closer. And this time she noticed something in his movements, a quiet acceptance, a surrender to the fact that the Apaches had protected her, and that whatever tension had drawn them all into this canyon could finally ease. He gestured toward her with a small, almost imperceptible motion, an acknowledgement of her presence and perhaps of her survival. She nodded weakly, unable to find words but feeling the bridge between them form in small human ways. In that fragile moment, the desert felt less like a trap and more like a place of lessons learned and respect earned. The Apaches circled her once more, checking her condition, making subtle adjustments to ensure she was warm and safe. The night air was cooling quickly, and the desert's chill had begun to seep into her bones. But the presence of these men, their protective vigilance, and the fire's gentle glow offered a fragile comfort. They had guided her through danger, had read the land in ways she could never have imagined, and now they allowed a small measure of rest. She realized that she owed them more than gratitude. She owed her continued survival to their skill, loyalty, and patience. As the hours passed, the tension that had gripped the canyon began to fade, replaced by quiet reflection. The stranger, who had once seemed a potential threat, now moved with a tentative calm, helping to adjust the fire and prepare a modest meal. The Apaches observed him closely, still cautious but no longer tense, and she sensed that trust was forming, fragile but real. The desert had tested them all, revealing both vulnerabilities and strengths. And now there was a fragile harmony in the canyon, a balance that had been earned through patience, observation, and courage. She thought of the journey that had brought her here, of the letters she had written, the hopes she had carried, and the life she had imagined waiting for her in another town, another time. Those dreams had seemed distant, almost unreachable, but now they felt more tangible, not because the desert had changed, but because she had. She had learned resilience, endurance, the quiet courage that came from relying on others while still finding strength within herself. Each hardship, each step through the harsh landscape, had carved lessons into her spirit that she would carry forever. The Apaches gathered around the fire, speaking softly in their own language, sharing glances and gestures that conveyed understanding beyond words. She could not follow their conversation, but she understood the meaning in their actions. They had fulfilled the vow they had silently sworn. To keep her alive and safe through the night, she felt a deep gratitude welling within her, not just for survival, but for the care, vigilance, and respect they had shown in a land that demanded nothing less than total awareness. The desert had been merciless, but it had also revealed allies in the most unexpected forms. The stranger finally spoke again, this time with less hesitation, offering explanations through gestures, brief words, and a tone that conveyed both apology and shared experience. She began to piece together his story. He was a traveler, caught in the desert's trials like herself, wary of danger and unprepared for the harshness of the night. The Apaches had intervened not only to protect her, but indirectly to mediate a tense encounter that could have escalated. The canyon had become a crucible, revealing human strength, courage, and the ability to navigate the unknown with intelligence and patience. Dawn began to touch the horizon, pale light creeping slowly over the jagged rocks, painting the canyon in muted shades of gold and gray. The fire had burned low, leaving glowing embers that lit the faces of the Apaches and the stranger in soft warmth. The desert's harsh lessons had given way to a fragile peace, one that she could finally breathe into fully. She stretched, feeling the ache in her muscles, the relief of life that had been hard won, and the cautious hope that the journey ahead, though uncertain, might continue. The Apaches packed up the remnants of the fire, their movements efficient and deliberate, teaching her again in silent ways how to respect the land and the dangers it held. The stranger offered a nod, an acknowledgement of both gratitude and the unspoken understanding that had formed during the long night. She felt a bond, fragile but real, between all of them, a shared experience of survival, fear, trust, and respect that transcended words. The desert had forced them into a crucible, but it had also created a connection that would linger far beyond the canyon walls. She allowed herself to reflect on the lessons learned: vigilance, patience, trust, and courage were as essential as water, shelter, and skill. The desert had stripped her bare, but it had also revealed the capacity for endurance, for forming alliances, and for finding strength in unexpected places. Each challenge had shaped her, and each act of care by the Apaches had reinforced the quiet truth that survival was never entirely solitary. She had been saved not just by skill, but by shared humanity, and that realization settled deeply in her heart. As the sun rose higher, warming the canyon, she felt a renewed sense of possibility. The journey that had seemed impossible the night before now felt achievable, though she understood that the desert would always hold risks. She looked to the Apaches, who had silently guided her through danger and uncertainty, and felt gratitude that went beyond words. They had been her guardians, teachers, and witnesses to a night that could have ended in despair. And their presence had made the difference between survival and tragedy. The stranger finally spoke more freely, offering details of his own journey, struggles, and his narrow escape from the desert's trials. The Apaches listened, nodding and understanding, occasionally exchanging subtle signals that conveyed caution and acceptance. She realized that their world was one of constant awareness, where every interaction mattered, and where life was measured in careful observation, courage, and action. The desert had tested them all, but it had also created a shared story of endurance and trust, one she would carry with her forever. By mid-morning, the canyon was bathed in warm sunlight, the fire reduced to scattered embers, and the desert seemed less threatening, though no less alive. She felt the weight of exhaustion lifting slowly, replaced by a sense of accomplishment, resilience, and gratitude. The Apaches had fulfilled their vow. The stranger had found his place in the fragile harmony of the canyon, and she herself had survived the desert's trials through courage, trust, and the quiet guidance of those who had chosen to protect her. She rose to her feet, stretching stiff muscles, and felt the rough sand beneath her shoes. The journey ahead remained uncertain, but the lessons of the night had become part of her. Trust, vigilance, patience, and courage were as vital as water and shelter in the desert. And she knew she would carry those truths forward into every step of the journey yet to come. The Apaches gathered around her, nodding in quiet acknowledgement, and the stranger offered a small smile. The night's trials had ended, but the story of survival, growth, and unexpected alliances would remain with them all. As she looked back once at the canyon where shadows had shifted, threats had lingered, and lives had been saved, she understood the deep truth the desert had revealed. Life could be harsh, unpredictable, and merciless, but it could also be generous, revealing allies, courage, and resilience in the most unexpected forms. She had been a mail-order bride lost in the desert, but she had emerged stronger, wiser, and connected to a world that demanded respect, awareness, and trust. The journey continued, but the night's lessons would remain indelible. And with the sun fully rising, casting golden light across the canyon, she stepped forward into the desert, no longer just a traveler seeking a new life, but a survivor, strengthened by the challenges she had endured and the bonds she had formed. The Apaches walked beside her, silent guardians of the land, and the stranger followed with cautious determination. The desert remained vast and untamed, but she had found her strength, her resilience, and the knowledge that even in the harshest places, human courage and trust could carve a path forward. The canyon fell behind them, the shadows of the night replaced by the promise of day, and the desert stretched endlessly ahead, full of danger, beauty, and lessons yet to be learned. She walked with steady steps, heart full of gratitude, mind sharp with vigilance, and spirit resilient. The story of survival, trust, and courage had reached its resolution in the canyon. Yet the desert would always whisper its challenges, and she would always remember the night when 3 Apaches swore to keep her alive, and she had found the strength to endure.